did you first grow curious about the paranormal? Dare you dig deeper? You are listening to House of Asher.
And welcome back to this new episode of House of Asher. We're on episode 72, and it is a perfectly dreary and rainy Saturday here in Western Kentucky. I kind of like it. It kind of can set up moods for whatever you're talking about, and I don't mind it. So hopefully you guys can handle a little pitter-pattering on the roof of my studio. What I want to talk to you guys about today, and we have a very interesting guest. Growing up, my family was pretty connected to the earth. Did a lot with herb gardens and things like that. I always had a garden, vegetable gardens. I always helped with this and that, and it always sort of made me feel connected. And I think that's probably a common thing, especially in a kind of a agricultural area like Western Kentucky. But I also had an interest reading like old history books that we would have county dowsers. And that was something that was just on the dole. It was how they were paid, and they would help find water and springs and things out in fields and whatnot for little communities to start up. And I've always had an interest in it. I've even used it in paranormal investigations. I hate to say ghost hunting. I never actually hunted a ghost. I don't have one on the wall. But in my time of that, I've been very lucky to have some interesting responses with it. But it goes further than that. I mean, it goes way back and then touches on, beliefs in ley lines and all this and that. And listening to a lot of the paranormal shows growing up, like Art Bell and things like this, I had come across a very talented and gracious woman who was nice enough to come on our show. A very talented individual. She is a second-generation dowser tutor. She was a former lecturer, and she actually discovered that the long-skulled people of Stonehenge, which I really want to get into that because I absolutely am batty for Stonehenge. Everybody, let me go ahead and introduce Miss Maria Wheatley. Welcome to the show, ma'am.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. And again, I hope you can make out my mishmash of Southern English. Like I said, we did kind of a number on it, but I'll try to keep it somewhat proper.
It's fine.
Okay. So tell me a little bit about, first of all, tell me a little about you, and for people who may not be very learned in this field or whatever, tell us a little bit about who you are, where you're from, and what got you into all the type of research and things that you do.
Yes, well, I live and have lived for quite some time in the heart of the megalithic capitals of England, such as Stonehenge, Avebury, and Silbury Hill. And I got brought up rather in a family that was interested in all sorts of different things, from dowsing to these wonderful ancient sites. So they've always been a part of my life. And as I got older, I got more interested into thinking, how were the stones moved? How did the ancients put these sites up? What is it about the energies there? How come these sites make people feel differently? And I suppose I'm still answering some of those questions, but I think I'm getting closer to the people and the ancient people that built these sites and some of their rites and belief systems. So I think I'm getting closer to knowing Stonehenge than has previously been thought.
So, you hear so much conjecture, and you have everybody going from, early ancient advanced humans to ancient visitors to the actual creators of mankind that bioengineered us and hybrided us with whatever things were here, with whatever their genetics were. What's your take on that? Do you feel that what was built, or what we see now at least, is something that humans made, and were there maybe even earlier structures that maybe have now fallen apart? Because I know there's parts of Stonehenge that I don't know if they fell or if they were removed. I know a lot of old structures, people would kind of borrow from them to build their own homes and things like that.
For sure, Stonehenge is very, very old. I think much older than the archaeologists give the orthodox date of 3000, 2500 BC. 2500 BC is a date that's used all across the world. It doesn't matter if it's an Egyptian pyramid going up or indeed an ancient site in the UK or Europe. I think they go back much, much further. And even before the stones got put up, there were timber structures, probably highly painted, for highly ornate structures that preceded the stone circle building phase alone. So the history goes back and back and back. Who built Stonehenge? I'm still not 100% sure about that myself. I'm getting closer to the people of the past through my work with the Long Skull people. But I think there's so many opinions out there, there really is. There's for as many days as the year, there's different opinions. So I think you just have to follow what you think is the truth at times.
Right. Well, it does really kind of come down to your intuition, or as I call it, my gut, very American-esque way of saying it. But, as I've said, I'd worked in law enforcement and things like that. And pretty much generally the first thing that comes to mind is generally pretty close to what most likely it is. Oftentimes people kind of tend to overthink it, as opposed to, how do I say this? I think we're kind of composed of 3 or 4 different entities. Okay, you have the intellect, you have the spiritual, and then you have maybe whatever baggage you've got, be it fear or this or whatever shortcomings and stuff that you pick up, kind of dragging through this world. And I mean, there's times to be analytical, but there's also times there's things that sort of supersede, I guess, rational thought, if that doesn't sound too over the top, but just a thing where if you get, there's a lot that you can figure out in life if you get very quiet and get very still. I find this especially true in outdoors, in a nature setting, be it if you're walking a path somewhere, or like you said, sitting on your back deck or patio, as you would say. And just sometimes you just have to stop talking and stop thinking and shut down. And sometimes you got empty hands at the end of it, but you've had a real good meditation and maybe prepares you for the next step of it. How do you do that when you have different people? That some people may come and go, because people are polarized. Even in this, I never realized how polarized paranormal circles were. It's just like politics, and some people don't want to come at you and go, here's what I think, but what's your 2 cents? And because sometimes it might be 2 different puzzle pieces that forms a whole, but it seems like people want to have kind of like arguing points at each other. They're trying to more or less convert you, as opposed to having an honest goodness discussion and try to learn. Sometimes it feels like to me.
Yes, exactly. And I think, ancient sites and power places mean different things to different people in their own understanding of where they are in their own selves and in the universe. So I think, when we go to these ancient sites, they kind of read us. They really do. They kind of understand where someone's coming from. And that may sound a little bit crazy, but they really do. So for one person, an ancient site mean one thing, an experience, and that might be different for another person. So I listen to everybody's stories and understandings, perceptions and interpretations. I don't think any one person has the whole answer. I think by coming together and discussing and having lots of different theories, we get closer to the truth. But one author, one answer, I don't think they're that simple to understand.
Right. Well, what's the old saying? A lot of times you get what you bring to something. It's sort of we had an old story, and I won't get off into this too deeply. You probably have some story similar to this, just in your own way. There's an old story called Stone Soup, where this guy, he was a very poor guy, and he was going to talk to these different people, and everybody was off on their own thing. And he's like, "Hey, do you have any food? I'm very hungry." "Well, I can't help you. I'm sorry." So he goes out, picks up an ordinary stone, puts it in water, starts cooking it, and everybody's like, "What's this guy doing?" So anyway, he's mixing this up. And long story short, people come by and go, "Oh, what are you making?" "Oh, it's a very interesting, unique meal called Stone Soup." And so they're talking, and it's like, "Oh, is it good?" "Oh, it's great." I said, "But it could use a carrot or two. So one person says, oh, wait a minute, I think I have a spare carrot. Then another person brings an onion, and then somebody brings potatoes. Before everything's done, everyone contributed in the community, and at the end, everybody had a great meal. And as opposed to pushing a stranger out, they welcomed them in. And it's sort of a, there's a moral behind it. But, it seems like the more that people can come together and kind of lay their own personal whatever dogma aside and different hang-ups or certain prejudices, and prejudices don't necessarily have to be racial. They can be a whole lot of different things. I know a lot of people who absolutely believe in ghosts, absolutely believe in this and that, but they go, Bigfoot, come on, that's nuts. Or on the other side, well, sure, Bigfoot or UFOs, but ghosts, come on. So it does seem like there's a lot of that. Let's talk a little bit about your long-skulled people. What's going on there?
Yeah, what's going on there? Indeed, for a start, no real history books ever speak about this. They don't speak about the back in the very early phase 1 of Stonehenge, going back, about 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years ago, that our ancient ancestors had quite long skulls and very narrow faces, quite different to the European skulls that we have today, which are quite round and quite full and quite broad from cheek to cheek. We're quite broad. Where compared to the narrow, long-faced people and long-skulled people. So they were very different. And also the very early inhabitants of the Stonehenge environs, and they made Stonehenge their spiritual capital, were also quite short. So they weren't tall. The average male was probably 5'6", and the average female just under 5 foot tall. So they were quite short people. But the amazing thing about these people is they moved the heaviest stones. So they weren't big, they weren't kind of giants, but they moved the heaviest stones. Because if you look to the phase 1s of all the different sort of sites around the area where you have huge stones, like just 17 miles away from Stonehenge, heading north, you have Aveburyhenge, and the very early stone set in there dated to the Neolithic. That's the period of the long skull people, 5,000 or so years ago. There's a stone there that weighs 100 tons. They were the ones that put those stones into place. They were the ones that kind of said, this is sacred energy, this is good earth energy. We're going like an acupuncture needle, if you will. We're going to place this stone into the ground. So they seem to focus very much in this area, and especially around the Stonehenge environs. And they created the very first monuments in the ancient landscape. And we're talking about 1,000 years before the stone circles got constructed. So yes, they were the ancient British people, the ancient Britons, the people of Albion.
Okay, let me ask you, I knew you had, because I kind of, as I try to do, research a little bit and have a little bit of an idea of what I'm talking about with who I'm speaking with. You were speaking of like the Neolithic Queen, and you talked about there was a massacre. You believe that's what happened with these people, that were they massacred at Stonehenge in some sort of ritual, or was it just invading armies, or what kind of, how does that all work in together?
Yeah, that's right. So the long skull people reigned peacefully for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then there seemed to be a kind of crisis point, although the antiquarians, the people that documented this, said that they felt at the time there must have been some kind of exchange and conflict that happened between round skull and long skull people. I'm starting to think that may be just a little bit too simple explanation. But nonetheless, if we look to the historical accounts, which got ignored by the mainstream archaeologists, and I think it's quite strange that someone just like myself should bring this history to the front of the public awareness when it should have been really academics like Oxford and Cambridge. But nonetheless, especially around Stonehenge, there was definitely a conflict that happened in the late Neolithic, and a lot of the people, the long skull people around the Stonehenge environs, showed that they had trauma wounds, and some of those were very It would have murdered them, it would have killed them, and then they were placed into the long barrows. But it's trying to understand what that conflict was. Why were there these two people? I mean, they could have been the round-skulled people, the European beaker culture that migrated across Europe around about 2500 BC using Orthodox dating. They seem to have come across Europe, and we know that through genetics, especially places like Holland and Germany. So that might have been some kind of warlike situation or a dispute over land or something, but really is shrouded in mystery because not the history isn't fully understood yet.
I was curious too about, I know you touched on a little bit on how these people were built. Could you touch a little bit more on, like, were they kind of blonde-haired, blue-eyed? Were they kind of dark-haired, almond-eyed people? Was just a mishmash of various things like that? And kind of, were they more kind of tribal?
Sure. Well, there was been a recent analysis of Oxford University on a very ancient skeleton that was found in a place called Somerset in the United Kingdom in England. And it's a Mesolithic, and that's a very old, say about 8,000 years old skeleton. And they started to, do a lot of DNA testing, etc. And they got a good firm idea of the kind of skin color and hair color and eye color. And indeed, if this is correct, then the ancient Britons looked quite Mediterranean. They had that olive, kind of Greek hue to the skin, probably had black hair and blue eyes. So instead of having the Mediterranean brown eyes, dark hair, the ancient British people of Albion, that's the old name for England, probably had blue eyes. And you even get this beautiful kind of colouring in Wales and Ireland today, in the ancient Celtic places, the pockets of the United Kingdom.
Well, no, I know I've seen in like other ancient structures, like you would see on like some of the pharaohs and things like that. It seemed like like you said, everything was painted very elaborately, a lot of blues and reds, and it seemed like a lot of times they had eyes of blue. And so I didn't know if there was some tie-in with those cultures with the long skulled people of Stonehenge or not. I've always wondered, again, like you said, how did these large stones go there? You hear everything from, well, they had sound technology, which could basically levitate and manipulate material, and which I'm like, these guys are making almost like razor sharp cuts. Stones come together in a lot of these type of things, and it just seems like they had to have some sort of technology or some sort of
for sure
knowledge that we just don't.
Yeah, I think it's lost knowledge. I mean, not just knowledge about cutting stone, it's the knowledge of where to place that stone. Because if you do place standing stones and you root them into earth energies or very deep underground aquifers, for example, they will emit natural energies. Yeah, like the underground water will slightly change the gravitational field around the area. So that's one change. The other thing that the long-skulled people noticed, for instance, was there's a very old site in the Avebury environs, like I said earlier, that's about 17 miles north of Stonehenge. It contains the largest stone circle in the world. And one part of that monument was called the Sanctuary, which is Neolithic, long-skulled monument. And when I took some tests there with a guy called Rodney Hale, we did some Geiger tests, for background ionizing radiation, gamma radiation.
Right.
And inexplicably, when you're in the center of that stone circle, you have a big flare-up. But you go outside the stone circle, and they're just markers today. The stones have long gone. When you go outside of the mark of the stone circle, it goes back to normal. So our ancient ancestors were looking at different things. It's almost like they knew what type of geology, earth energy, water energy beneath the ground was, and they placed their ancient sites upon them, creating power places. So it's not just about cutting the stone, it's about placing the stone. And they did that worldwide, from whether it was the pyramids, they're placed beneath above very deep aquifers, aquifers, and the same holds for ancient sites worldwide. So there seems to have been like this general understanding of geomancy, earth wisdom, earth knowledge, earth lore, that people followed no matter where you lived upon planet Earth.
Yeah, it seems like, and this is what ties it with ley lines, I'm assuming. Had one quick question from Chad in the room, in the chat room. How do the elongated skull people of the Britons compare or contrast with the elongated skulls, I'm assuming, people of South America? Is there any connection, or is it just a totally different type of thing that happened? Were the skulls shaped by themselves, or was that just a natural way their skulls grew, I think is what he's trying to ask.
Sure, that's a really good question, and thanks for asking. I have taken Brian Forrester, who's a world authority on the elongated skulls of Paracas around Stonehenge, and we've had good conversations about the differences between these two people. The Paracas skulls of South America are very conical. And they're kind of conical, as it were, whereas the ancient British people were more long-skulled, a bit like, Tutankhamun. He had a very long skull. The long-skulled people of Malta, they had the long skull, so they were very different. And no, they weren't modified in any way, because some of the antiquarians of Europe, especially around Malta and France, for example, they drew out some child skulls because they were just drawing them in photography or anything like that. Right. So they drew them out, and they drew long-skulled children's skulls at a very young age. So the head binding is out of the question. These were a natural skull type. Although some of the rounder skulled people of the Bronze Age, that's about 500 years after the Neolithic, there is some evidence of head binding, but that's probably because they wanted to look like the long skulled people. And even if you went to Germany, about sort of 800 years ago, the Huns, for example, they would manipulate their head shape because it was a sign of aristocracy, wealth, and deemed very attractive by men and women to look like that. But no, in ancient Britain, they were naturally long-skulled, but not as conical as the skulls of Paracas.
Right. It does seem like that's one of those emulation, and it's the sincerest form of flattery, right? Is trying to take on certain elements of that, and I'm sure there's that certain amount of social climb as well, which we would think that's a very strange, modulation, or changing to yourself. But different times, different people. I know that like you said, there are so many different connections with when you get into elongated skulls, and then you get into questions of like, well, is there a connection to the Nephilim and all that? Do you have any, what's your beliefs on any of that?
Well, I think until we get some really good DNA testing done, the jury's out for me. But I did speak to Brian about this, and he said some of the independent DNA testing of the Paracas skulls that he announced, I think it was this February, but don't quote me on that, it could have been a bit earlier or a bit later, seemed to indicate very strongly that the DNA was coming from the Crimea, around the kind of Siberia Russian end. So that's where some DNA testing is, but and they were a little bit taller than the ancient British people. So until we get DNA testing, it could well be something like that. But on the other hand, it could be a different pocket of people, just like you get Chinese, Japanese, English, etc. I think we need to really understand and study more. But the problem is, as Brian found himself with the skulls of Paracas, as indeed I find myself in, it is very hard to get these skulls photographed and viewed, and to even ask. I've asked twice now for a DNA testing, which I have backing for, and the academic doors of the universities seem to close even louder. They don't seem to want to embrace further understanding and to gain knowledge of these ancient people.
Well, it does really seem like there's a, and I really try not to be a conspiracy guy because it's so easy to do. But it's a thing of, it does really seem like if it does not fit into a certain criteria and into a certain mold, into a certain time frame, it doesn't matter if it's accurate or not, it's pushed away. Which the basis of science, as you all know, is you have to look at something. Of course, you want to have a control group, but you have to look at variables and these different things that come out that's not going to fit into your mode. And if you have enough of that coming through and it proves to be true, then your theory, which is all most of this stuff is incomplete or wrong, but it seems like there's a certain structure and a cabal of people who do not want this ancient knowledge known. And I know, again, that sounds very shadowy and whatnot, and I'm not trying to sound like that, but it's just a thing of what else can you call it if you have people willfully blocking this information.
I agree. I think there is definitely a block out there on this with the wider academic community, but to some respects, you can't hold knowledge back once it's out there. You can't. You have to address it, and even if it does take a little bit of time, I think it will get addressed. That's for sure. And I think once we understand the long-skulled people, we can begin to understand their monuments a little bit better. Because one thing that I noticed in my research was that the long-skulled people tended to construct very long, elongated monuments, such as the Cursors monument. That was named after an antiquarian called William Stukely, who thought they were Roman racing courses, which they're not, but that's where the name Cursors comes from. And these are huge monuments. Some of them are 2 miles long, 7 miles long. They are gigantic earthen constructions. What's going on there? Nobody's really addressed that. Even the alternative archaeological community doesn't really address these monuments. So I think once we kind of really delve into the ancient past, we become closer to the ancients because of the monuments they left behind, or really a physical link to the ancient world.
Well, you were talking about the long, elongated structures, which kind of makes me think of stuff, of course, like Easter Island, which I don't know the connections necessarily with all these, unless maybe they are laying on PowerPoints and ley lines. But it seems like, and maybe you've noticed it, or maybe you never come to with anything again with prejudices or free-formed opinions. But like you said, if you kind of go into it with a certain mind frame, say like you were talking about the Romans, let's just say a Roman-centric mind frame, you'll see these and go, oh, of course, those are roads. These are made for whatever, because you're putting your cultural value system on there. And it seems like you went in there, I'm assuming pretty much fairly open, but the longer you were immersed in studying these people's culture, the more that it kind of like come into view, like the focus come into view, like, oh, okay, well, this is this. Of course it's this. As opposed to, again, trying to make it fit into your worldview so that you don't have to change how you think or how you proceed in your next step of research.
I mean, the one thing they do all have in common, the long-skulled monuments, is that they seem to be quite accurately aligned to the moon. Now, the moon is very complicated in its cycles, not like the sun. The sun is actually quite simple. It takes 1 year to go around, and you can work out the equinoxes and the solstices. Relatively easy. It's not that difficult, and that's what most of the later stone circles were built on, solar alignments. Well, the majority, not every single one, but the earlier monuments seem to be focused on the very complex and complicated moon's metonic cycle, which is every 18.61 years. And no matter where you go, if you were in Stonehenge, the first astronomy was to do with the moon. And even if you go very high to the north of the British Isles, you come to the lovely Scotland, and the Scottish ancient sites they're called recumbrant stone circles, and that doesn't mean they've fallen down. It's just the name recumbrant. It's where you get a circle of stones with 2 very tall standing stones, and 1 stone placed in between those 2 tall standing stones on its side, so it creates a kind of false horizon line. And these were very colourful places in the ancient past. For example, at one Scottish stone circle you had 2 tall granite grey-like standing stones, and the recumbrant, or that stone on its side was pink granite next to a red jasper standing stone. So they were colourful places, and they were aligned perfectly to the moon's metonic cycle, especially the setting of the southern phase of the moon. And these are really complicated to work out. But more than that, it was shown with some radiation tests on one major lunar standstill at a stone circle in Scotland called the Easter Aquathes, that at the moment that big moon set in the west, at that precise moment there was a huge flare-up of radiation outside of the stone circle, which is inexplicable because it defies science. So our ancient ancestors were tuning into all different types of earth energy, not just the earth energy that we think is benign in the ground, but gamma radiation as well.
Wow. When you're talking about like the energies from the ground and things like that, of course everybody thinks of, again, ley lines and things like that, and kind of holistic medicines and going to holy places and healing places. But for me, being a big sci-fi kid and growing up with all that, my mind goes to people like Nikola Tesla. Do you think that more or less, just like kids who are kind of recreating the wheel, are we basically slowly coming back to where we, what I'm saying, coming back to center after being pushed away so long through the Dark Ages and the destruction of Alexandria and God knows what was in there? Where do you think that we're going to get back to that? Do you think that maybe we'll get some of that knowledge, but we're obviously going to have some of our own cultural tweaks on it? Or do you think we'll ever kind of get back to a more perfect, if you can call it that, civilization?
I think we do. You're very correct in saying we do project our cultural ideas and interpretations onto things in the past. That's to some degree how one makes sense of it. But I do think we need to be more open-minded and broad-minded, because I've been into earth energies and earth mysteries now for over 25 years, and I've seen things even change their names. You used to get something called an earth gate, that's become a portal, and that becomes a fashionable word. You have sort of sound technology is very much to the fore at the moment. I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I'm saying that, I think sometimes to understand the full picture, you need to step outside of the box of what the current trend of thinking is to delve even deeper. It's probably a combination of lots of different things. But even if we take a mound in this area called Silbury Hill, it's the largest man-made mound in Europe, and you're talking about, technology, etc., then you have different layers of material. You have organic and inorganic, organic and inorganic, and it goes up several layers, and then it's surrounded by massive chalk block, and then it was smoothed over to make it look very chalk white, a gigantic structure covering over 5 acres. Well, according to, people like Wilhelm Reich, that could create and generate what he called orgon, which was free energy. So I think, yes, some of these power places, I believe, were quite practical in the sense that they could produce things and influence things as well, because it was well known that if you place unripened fruit into a stronger magnetic field, it ripens faster. And what we note about places like Avebury and Stonehenge, they do, generally speaking, tend to have stronger magnetic fields that can influence seeds and the ripening of fruits. So they could be used on a very practical level as well as a spiritual level. So I see an ancient power place as being multifaceted. It isn't just one thing at any one time. It could be ritualistic, aligned to certain sunrises, sunsets, moonrises, moonrises and moonsets, and also be used on a very practical agricultural level, as well as possibly producing free energy.
Right. I was thinking the penitentiary that I'd worked at, and there's a reason I'm bringing this up. It was made primarily out of limestone, which has a lot of quartz in it. It was mined from that area. There was a large man-made body of water from a dam that was a few miles up. And we also have what we call a karst system, Karst, and it basically means all the ground that we're on is kind of Swiss cheesed. It's got all these holes and natural aquifers running through it constantly, and everything has a frequency. Everything has a certain amount of energy or life to it. If you want to get like the Native Americans with it, water, even running water, has a frequency. So, whereas a place like Stonehenge seems to have been more of a spiritual growing center, power center, maybe even a revitalizing center. Places like the penitentiary that I worked, there was so much death, abuse, neglect, fear, all that, and that's what stayed there, and that's why there were so many what they call hauntings reported. It's just interesting that, like you said, it's sort of a flip side of a coin. A knife can cut a steak, or a knife can kill somebody, just like one of those stones could heal somebody, or it could trap somebody and imprison somebody. So it's interesting to see that dichotomy, the two faces of that energy, because just earth energy, like most people, you can look at it and go, well, that's a very kind of a sexy, natural calling thing, but it can also be used for very dark motives as well. Now, in regards of like Stonehenge, and you said now there had been some sacrifices and death there, but overwhelmingly, do you get a positive feeling from there? Do you get a kind of a recharge from there? Because I know many people that speak about going to some of those places, like you talked about Malta and places like that. They say if you are there for a certain amount of time, you do feel kind of revitalized, you do feel recharged.
Oh, absolutely, because the shape of the the stone circle itself, i.e. being a circle, generates energy. You're on about everything has its frequency, everything is living. The druids certainly thought that over here. So yeah, the shape of the circle alone generates energy bands of energy. That's just the circle itself. Now place it on some really good, powerful earth energy, and then you have the stones interacting with that energy, because there's no difference between a standing stone that an ancient man put up at somewhere like Avebury, Stonehenge, or Newgrange, wherever, to the semiconductors from Silicon Valley in your neck of the woods as well, in America. So they're very, very similar. They conduct and store and can transmit energy, and how you interact with that is you are that component. So I say to people that I take to these ancient sites on tours and things and on workshops is, set your intents. Interact with the monument and with its energetic field. And you are in an altered state of consciousness when you enter an ancient site, be that in Egypt or the ancient United Kingdom. You are in an altered state. It might seem that everything seems the same and feels the same, but it isn't. And you can come out there, very differently. And even the ancient Greeks and their writers and scholars around AD 170 to say, 236 AD, they were having arguments within the Alexandrian schools of who actually taught Pythagoras. Was it the ancient druids, because they were very renowned in their astronomy and earth sciences? Did they influence Pythagoras, or did Pythagoras introduce the druids? That was an argument round about AD 170. So again, we have to think outside of the box. People come together, they exchange ideas, and we all grow together. And I think that's what was happening with the Druids and Pythagoras, for example. People work together and they come out with fantastic ideas. But to answer your question, Stonehenge is transformative. Avebury is very healing in terms of earth energies. Each site has its own spirit of place, its own ambience, and in a way its own guardians, its own life force. And it's by interacting with one site, you will feel differently at one site to another. That is very common for most people. So not all of stone circles will be healing. Do you see what I mean? Some will be transformative, some are quite alchemic, some are very inspirational places, and others are very gentle and healing, and they have that sort of resonance. Our ancient ancestors were making different places for different purposes.
Okay. We have an area here, I don't know if you've ever, what parts of the U.S. you've been to, if at all, But in the south, there's an area called Mammoth Cave, and it's a very long, extensive area. It had been used for, well, the Native Americans had taken shelter there, supposedly way back in the past during some cataclysm, which they were able to find fresh water. And understand, these caves are like cathedrals. They're massive, and they go on for hundreds of miles. They go from out beyond Kentucky all the way down into Tennessee. It actually runs under my town, the fingers of it. And you've had it's had such a strange life. Like a lot of places, like civilizations are built on top of civilization on top of civilizations. I mean, they had used part of that as an old TV ward at one time when they were in inclement weather. So it seems that you were talking about the altered state element, because of course, my mind goes to the movie, but you being connected spiritually to the earth and things like that, you can achieve the same sort of thing without induction of this or that or any of the tanks, for me anyway, by being out in nature, being amongst the rocks and the foliage, and just the kind of setting your natural circadian rhythm with nature. And you kind of turn off your phone and you just are. You have no agenda. Your agenda is receiving, as opposed to be always to transmit, which is hard for us, because that's just the nature of people a lot. We've forgotten how to receive, and I think it's something that's really important. I'm jokingly saying this, but this is absolutely true. I'm actually sitting there doing this interview with no shoes. I'm very much that guy. A lot of times it's too cold right now. It's winter time here, but a lot of times before shows I would go out back and sort of walk through the grass and just sort of ground myself. I don't know what that is. That was just something I've always kind of did, and it always sort of, I don't know what it was. It kind of reset me, and it's like it pulled all the negative out of me and all the, I sound like I'm like deep or something. I'm not trying to sound like I know anything, but it's just, I didn't know it. I mean, I knew it, but I don't know what it is, and I just
exactly.
Knew it was just something natural. That's all I know.
Absolutely. And the wonderful thing about earth energies, a good geomancer or a good dowser looks to nature to find things. Okay, so over here we have yew trees, and in the States you have a particular type of pine. I can't think what it's called at the moment. I think it begins with P, but anyway, you have a particular type of pine tree. They grow over very, very deep aquifers. Large natural abundance of sage in the US is growing over positive earth energy, and over here it would be called Ramson's wild garlic. And so you can go out in nature. Just because you don't have Stonehenge on your doorstep doesn't mean that you don't have the earth energies that are very positive and healing. And like I say, a good geomancer looks around the landscape and thinks that large naturally placed pine, I'm not talking about ones that line streets or something, but the ones in nature knows really what's good for it. So there's an old saying over here from the medieval times: build your farmstead where the sheep doth lie, because where the sheep lie, that's where there's good earth energies, and that's where all the old English farmers used to build their farmsteads. They used to watch what the animals did and then adopt where they would put their farms. Where animals now, yeah, exactly, because they know the energies beneath their feet, and that's why you get really strange locations of farmhouses in the UK. It's because they were all following the sheep, literally. And then where animals give birth, for example, because a dog or a cat that isn't confined to the house will want to go out into nature, break free to give birth naturally. They will find these beautiful spiral earth energy patterns. They will give birth above them, and their offspring will be healthier. There was a massive survey done between 1940 and 1960 by a master dowser who recognized all these things that the animals adopt. So animals are really switched on to earth energies. They really are.
Yeah, it's so like I said, it's different, and it seems like people have moved so far away from the things that are natural. We've got to a certain point again, and I know I sound like I'm trying to sound deep. I'm not. It's just it's just a thing where, and it happens in small cities too. It's not just large cities, but it just seems like you said, there's that disconnect, and we're no longer in the natural world. We have kind of cut ourselves out over here, thinking somehow we're above it. But what we've done, we've basically cut the roots to our tree, severing that connection and that healing energy. And it really seems that, again, it's sort of like we're, sawing the edge of the limb that we're standing on. I was going to ask you real quick too, if you have any sites that you want people to go to, how they can contact you, and also any other events. I want you to go ahead and say that if you happen to have that ready.
Sure. I've got 2 websites. I've got one website that focuses on earth energy, megalithic power. It's got some fantastic articles on and what I do at ancient sites, and that's called the Avebury Experience.co.uk. That's Avebury, Avebury, the Avebury Experience.co.uk. I've also got a teaching college where I'm certified to some top colleges here in the UK for certificates, and that's esotericcollege.com, where I teach dowsing across Skype. I have students all across America. I'll be actually coming to America twice next year.
Awesome.
One of which is going to be Contact in the Desert. I will be lecturing and doing workshops there, and I'll also be leading a tour of your ancient sites in a place called New England, around a place called Salem, and I will be leading a big tour there, and where we'll be accessing some of your wonderful ancient sites, because you're always talking about Stonehenge and elsewhere, but
right.
Goodness gracious me, you have some amazing ancient sites, and I want to come across, show you the energies there so that you can all run with them and experience your places of power and reactivate them. The more people that go to places, you can activate them, set your intent, and great changes can happen through that beautiful relationship of man and power place, or woman and power place.
Right. Well, and that's very important that you put that little caveat to it, because people, like you said, again, people in sort of that patriarchal thing, and it's very male dominated. Magic, which magic doesn't necessarily have to be whatever. Magic is just energy, so it's just how you manipulate it. But it seems it is definitely feminine based. I think you have to have that connection with the feminine world in regards of energy and the way it works. And this is just from an outsider's view. I'm not a practitioner, but like you said, I've like yourself, I've tried to read a whole lot, and in the 30 or 40 years I've been trying to do this sort of stuff. But you have to talk about, well, just in the name itself, the sacred feminine, that connection. There's a very nurturing element to it, and a very deep element to it, that if you like you said, if we get very quiet and we open ourselves up, and you go and you stimulate that energy and you interact with it, there's you don't even have to do anything, just be there, and nature does it on its own. It's a self-fulfilling thing that, again, you don't seem like you have to overthink it, and it seems like the more you overthink it, the more you sabotage it. At least in my view.
Absolutely. Intent is everything, and setting a good intent at an ancient site or by a beautiful old tree. Like I say, it doesn't have to be a stone circle, or where there's an abundance in nature of beauty, of flowers, of sage. They're places where you can go and interact with the earth and its energy system and become a part of that. It's like forming a relationship with power of place, and when you form that relationship with power of place, you then can make changes. You can make changes in your own life, in your own mindset, and to the people by you. And that's why people used to come together at the ancients at particular times of the year, those 8 sacred Sabbats, those 8 sacred days of the solar year, when the veil is thin, to make those changes happen. And we've just had one on November the 1st, or Halloween, as it was Christianized too. We call that as Druids, Samhain. We're coming up to the next power place in the solar calendar, and that's the winter solstice, when again the veil is thin then and the sun is reborn. In Druidry, and that's why the Son of God was his birthday got changed to the 25th of December. These are power times at power places. So breathe in that magic, and they're the best times to make changes to one's life.
And it's funny that you mentioned how, like you said, everything gets tweaked and everything is borrowed from earlier civilizations and their root homes and motherlands and stuff. Because I'll have friends and I'll explain to about the Saturnalia holiday and how it ties in with this and that, which it used to be a pretty bawdy holiday at one time. And I have a lot of friends who are very religious, and that's fine. But I'm going, okay, I know you guys kind of pick at me about this and that, but the Yule log and all this and that, that's ancient faith. I don't call it pagan faith because it depends on who you're talking to if they feel it's pagan or not. But for me, it's just the old gods and the old ways, and I don't know. To me, there's a lot of truth in that, and I've always just been curious like that. But I will ask you in the last couple minutes that we got, and again, I appreciate you being on, and I will talk to you off air once I get through the little outro. But where do you either see in regards of end game, or is there an end game to all these different sites in the ley line connections? And will any of that change? Say, they've always been predicting, like pole shifts and stuff. Will that affect the ley lines, or will it always reset back to the ley lines as we know them?
That's a really good question. I really do believe that in my understanding of leys and earth currents, especially the earth currents that entwine the leys, they're exceptionally powerful. They do seem to be quite fixed, because other researchers before myself, for instance, have plotted them, and then they've been anchored in for thousands and thousands of years. But whether a big climate change, be that a pole shift or anything that's very, very dramatic, will change it. Yes, it will. One thing that is going to change the ley lines, one thing that is going to change the earth currents, and that's 5G. And we really have to look about, how we're using modern day equipment that could affect leys, because there were grid systems that used to be considered benign, such as the Hartmann grid, discovered by Dr. Hartmann in the 1950s. It was always considered by geomancers and dowsers, for decades, to be benign. But that seems to be now in places in cities where you have a lot of, very big, routers and masks and things like that, starting to conduct man-made signals. So I do see the ancient system changing, and I think we have to take responsibility for that.
Right. Well, I mean, what's the old saying? Just because you can doesn't necessarily mean you should. And you have to have wisdom with the technology and wisdom with the power that you have. And, I remain hopeful. Obviously, was it guarded optimism? But I hope that there's more of a spiritual awakening, which, I already see it in a lot of people. I've seen it myself. I've always been a bit of a, I don't know. I was a very hopeful young person, and then working, and especially, dealing with a lot of darker things in people and seeing a lot of darkness. You get hardened up, and it's taken me years to open myself up spiritually like this. So it's one of those things where I think everyone has a tipping point, and it's up to them which way they go. And I pray that we all can come together as people and for the betterment of just the race and the world, and take it from there.
Well said.
Occasionally I have a good one. Man, well, listen, Maria, I appreciate you being here, and I do want to have you back on. Especially, I want to really get deeper into some of the ley line questions, and sure, the reasonings for them. The underlying reason is it's something that was necessarily natural, if it was something magical if it was maybe a little bit of both. Because I don't know, the older, which I'm 50. Well, actually, I just had a birthday yesterday. I'm 59 now, or not 59. I feel like I'm 59. I'm 49. See, I'm lying to you. I'm 49, and I was looking at the time. I'm 49. And the older I get, the more I want to believe in magic. So maybe there's hope for me.
Definitely.
Well, Maria, like I said again, thank you for being on, and I want to make sure that everybody goes and checks out your pages, and please keep following this show on steveeasher.com. You also go to House of Asher on YouTube and under Conflict Radio. You feel free to contact me on my YouTube page, my Facebook page, my email, all lowercase and together, ILASHERS at yahoo.com. That's eyelashers at yahoo.com. And just keep positive thoughts in mind. But I want you to go out and enjoy the rest of your day, and I want you to drink deep of the fruits of the world. But as the sun gets low and the shadows grow long, check your closet, check under your bed. You never know, there may be something very interesting, or it might be something very dark. But either way, it's all part of nature, so we have to deal with it either way, don't we? But until next time, love yourselves, love each other, take care, and I will see you again. Take care.